The Sinking of the Titanic and Other Great Sea Disasters, edited by Logan Marshall. I am willing to remain and play the man's game if there are not enough boats for more than the women and children. I won't die here like a beast. I'll meet my end as a man. There was a pause, and then Mr. Guggenheim continued. Tell my wife, Johnson, if it should happen that my secretary and I both go down and you are saved, tell her I played the game out straight and to the end. No woman shall be left aboard this ship because Ben Guggenheim was a coward. Tell her my last thoughts will be of her and of our girls, but that my duty now is to these unfortunate women and children on this ship. Tell her I will meet whatever fate is in store for me, knowing she will approve of what I do. In telling the story, the room steward said the last he saw of Mr. Guggenheim was when he stood fully dressed upon the upper deck, talking calmly with Colonel Astor and Major Butt. Before the last of the boats got away, according to some of the passengers' narratives, there were more than 50 shots fired upon the decks by officers or others in the effort to maintain the discipline that until then had been well preserved. The sinking vessel. Richard Norris Williams, Jr., one of the survivors of the Titanic, saw his father killed by being crushed by one of the tremendous funnels of the sinking vessel. We stood on deck watching the lifeboats of the Titanic being filled and lowered into the water, said Mr. Williams. The water was nearly up to our waists, and the ship was about at her last. Suddenly, one of the great funnels fell. I sprang aside, endeavoring to pull my father with me. A moment later the funnel was swept overboard and the body of father went with it. I sprang overboard and swam through the ice to a life raft and was pulled aboard. There were 5 men and 1 woman on the raft. Occasionally we were swept off into the sea, but we always managed to crawl back. A sailor lighted a cigarette and flung the match carelessly among the women. Several screamed, fearing they would be set on fire. The sailor replied, "We are going to hell anyway, and we might as well be cremated now as then." A huge cake of ice was the means of aiding Emile Portaleppi of Italy in his hairbreadth escape from death when the Titanic went down. Portaleppi, a second-class passenger, was awakened by the explosion of one of the bulkheads of the ship. He hurried to the deck, strapped a life preserver around him, and leaped into the sea. With the aid of the preserver, and by holding on to a cake of ice, he managed to keep afloat until one of the lifeboats picked him up. There were 35 other people in the boat, he said, when he was hauled aboard. The coward. Somewhere in the shadow of the appalling Titanic disaster slinks, still living by the inexplicable grace of God, a cur in human shape, today the most despicable human being in all the world. In that grim midnight hour, already great in history, he found himself hemmed in by the band of heroes whose watchword and countersign rang out across the deep, "Women and children first." What did he do? He scuttled to the stateroom deck, put on a woman's skirt, a woman's hat, and a woman's veil, and picking his crafty way back among the brave and chivalric men who guarded the rail of the doomed ship, he filched a seat in one of the lifeboats and saved his skin. His name is on that list of branded rescued men who were neither picked up from the sea when the ship went down, nor were in the boats under orders to help them get away safe. His identity is not yet known, though it will be in good time. So foul an act as that will out like murder. The eyes of strong men who have read this crowded record of golden deeds, who have read and reread that deathless roll of honor of the dead, are still wet with tears of pity and pride. This man still lives. Surely he was born and saved to set for men a new standard by which to measure infamy and shame. It is well that there was sufficient heroism on board the Titanic to neutralize the horrors of cowardice. When the first order was given for the men to stand back, there were a dozen or more who pushed forward and said that men would be needed to row the lifeboats, and that they would volunteer for the work. The officers tried to pick out the ones that volunteered merely for service, and to eliminate those who volunteered merely to save their own lives. This elimination process, however, was not wholly successful. The doomed men. As the ship began to settle to starboard, heeling at an angle of nearly 45 degrees, those who had believed it was all right to stick by the ship began to have doubts, and a few jumped into the sea. They were followed immediately by others, and in a few minutes there were scores swimming around. Nearly all of them were life preservers. One man, who had a Pomeranian dog, leaped overboard with it, and striking a piece of wreckage was badly stunned. He recovered after a few minutes and swam toward one of the lifeboats and was taken aboard. Said one survivor, speaking of the men who remained on the ship, "There they stood, Major Butt, Colonel Astor, waving a farewell to his wife, Mr. Thayer, Mr. Case, Mr. Clarence Moore, Mr. Widener, all multimillionaires, and hundreds of other men, bravely smiling at us all. Never have I seen such chivalry and fortitude, such courage in the face of fate horrible to contemplate, filled us, even then, with wonder and admiration." Why were men saved? Others who seek to make the occasional male survivor a hissing scorn. And yet the testimony makes it clear that for a long time during that ordeal the more frightful position seemed to many to be in the frail boats in the vast, relentless sea, and that some men had to be tumbled into the boat under orders from the officers. Others expressed the deepest indignation that 210 sailors were rescued. The testimony shows that most of these sailors were in the welter of ice and water into which they had been thrown from the ship's deck when she sank. They were human beings, and so were picked up and saved. Women and children first. The one alleviating circumstance in the otherwise immitigable tragedy is the fact that so many of the men stood aside really without the necessity for the order, "Women and children first," and insisted that the weaker sex should first have places in the boats. There were men whose word of command swayed boards of directors, governed institutions, disposed of millions. They were accustomed merely to pronounce a wish to have it gratified. Thousands posted at their bidding. The complexion of the market altered hue when they nodded. They bought what they wanted, and for one of the humblest fishing smacks or a dory they could have given the price that was paid to build and launch the ship that has become the most imposing mausoleum that ever housed the bones of men since the pyramids rose from the desert sands. But these men stood aside, one can see them, and gave place not merely to the delicate and the refined, but to the scared Czech woman from the steerage, with her baby at her breast, the Croatian with a toddler by her side, coming through the very gate of death and out of the mouth of hell to the imagined Eden of America. To many of those who went, it was harder to go than to stay there on the vessel, gaping with its mortal wounds and ready to go down. It meant that tossing on the waters they must wait in suspense, hour after hour, even after the lights of the ship were engulfed in appalling darkness, hoping against hope for the miracle of a rescue dearer to them than their own lives. It was the tradition of Anglo-Saxon heroism that was fulfilled in the frozen seas during the black hours of Sunday night. The heroism was that of the women who went, as well as of the men who remained.